In this lesson, we're talking about how plants are classified. Plants are classified into two main categories, non-vascular and vascular. The first category we're going to look at is non-vascular. But before we do that, let's look at a review of what vascular tissue is. Vascular tissue is a system of tube-like structures inside a plant through which water, minerals, and food move. If we look at the picture on the next, so let's take a look at some examples of plants that are non-vascular plants, plants that do not have that vascular tissue. If you look in the photo here, this is moss growing on the ground and up the sides of these trees. Another example down here, this is moss growing on a rock, and it has grown some reproductive structures that we'll talk about in a minute. So moss is an example of a non-vascular plant. Non-vascular plants have no cell walls, there's no roots, they're usually low growing, and they live in damp, shady places. If we look at a diagram of a moss plant, like all non-vascular plants, the water does not pass from the roots up through all parts of the plant like it does in a plant that has vascular tissue. Instead, all parts of the plant absorb water and materials directly from their surroundings. You can see moss has a plant part called a rhizoid, and it kind of looks like a root, and its job, just like a root's job, is to anchor the moss in place, and it does absorb water and nutrients, but instead of flowing through vascular tissue up through all parts of the plant, it just passes from cell to cell. The leaf-like and stem-like structures can also absorb water and materials though too. Another example of a plant that it has non-vascular tissue are these things called liverworts, and they're given their name, they're given their name based on the fact that they look like the inside of a liver. And just like moss, they're found growing in wet areas, damp areas, areas that are shady, a lot of times along the sides of creeks and other streams and rivers, on rocks. It can grow right into the soil, but they look like this. They are liverworts. There are also these things called hornworts, and these are a little bit different. They do not have vascular tissue, just like the other two examples, but they're different because they don't grow on rocks or tree trunks. They're more likely to be found mixed in with grass, and you can see these are the little hornwort structures here.
That the word vascular means tubes, that it has some sort of tube system that carries material throughout the plant, versus a non-tube plant like a moss that does not actually have tubes to carry water or food, but rather soaks up materials more like a sponge. Okay, so once again, those tubes, the vascular system describes how plants transport water and nutrients. Most plants are vascular. Most plants have a tube system like a stem. In fact, about 75% or 3/4 of all plants in the world are vascular. The rest are non-vascular. And I just had a picture here that shows an experiment you can do to prove plants, or some plants, have a vascular system. Is you can take, for instance, white carnations. You can see they have a stem, which is a type of tube, and you put that in water that has been colored with dyes. For instance, a green dye, a blue dye, or a purple dye. And you can see that after a while it will actually carry the dye up through the plant and will end up coloring the carnation itself the same color as the dye. So once again, vascular plants have a system of tubes. Basically, these tubes are roots that take in water and nutrients from the soil. They can be stems, which then carry it throughout the plants. They're also the leaves, because leaves have, if you look at them, they have what look like almost veins that then carry the food and the water throughout the leaf into the stem and the rest of the plant. There are two types of tubes a plant can have. The first is called xylem. These are tubes that carry just water. And I kind of remember them because in the alphabet, W comes right before X, you know, W, X, Y, Z, so water, xylem, they go together. Versus the other type of tube, which is phloem. Phloems are tubes that conduct other things throughout the plant, mostly food. So phloem, food, both start with the same sounding phonics, so you know they go together as well.
The gymnosperms, a diverse group of plants, are most familiar to us as the cone-bearing, needle-leafed trees of pine, fir, and spruce. However, many gymnosperms bear little resemblance to these trees. There are four classes of gymnosperms: the Cycadophyta, the Ginkgophyta, the Coniferophyta, and the Gnetophyta. The Cycadophyta, or cycads, are a very old group of plants. They have large palm-like leaves, short barrel-shaped trunks, and huge cones. Mainly tropical or subtropical in distribution, they are also grown as ornamental plants in greenhouses or outside in warmer climates. The Ginkgophyta, a small group of plants, consists of a single species, ginkgo, a broad-leafed tree with a tall, stately trunk. Although considered a living fossil, it is often grown as a shade tree along city streets. The Coniferophyta, or conifers, are the largest class of gymnosperms and those most familiar to us. They include the pines, firs, spruces, cedars, and redwoods. The Coniferophyta contains the largest and oldest of living organisms. The fourth class of gymnosperms, the Gnetophyta, is a collection of strange plants that includes a desert shrub, a plant with only 2 leaves, and a tree that looks like an angiosperm. A world without flowering plants would be dull indeed. We would miss the reds, yellows, blues, oranges, violets, and all the other hues of flowers, and many fruits. In the autumn, we would miss the great displays of red, yellow, and orange as the leaves of many flowering trees turn color. But of still greater importance would be the lack of our major sources of food. All of our basic foods come from flowering plants. Wheat, corn, rice, sugarcane, all of our fruits and vegetables are flowering plants. The flowering plants, or angiosperms, are an important part of our environment, appealing to our senses in many ways. This is no accident of evolution, but an important facet of the life of angiosperms, for the flowering plants evolved not only to life on land, but also to life on land inhabited by animals. The colors and aromas of flowers, which so delight us, attract insects and other animals necessary for pollination. The colors and aromas of fruits entice us and a wide range of animals to eat them and spread the seed. The spines and hooks on seeds are caught in fur, and the animals provide transportation over many miles. Of the total of about 300,000 plant species, some 275,000 are angiosperms. This largest group of plants is divided into several hundred families. The individual species come in every conceivable size and shape. There are angiosperm trees that challenge the great conifers in size. There are tiny floating angiosperms that are little more than drifting leaves. There are great climbing vines that can kill the largest tree. There are beautiful and delicate plants that bloom in the spring.
Monocot and dicot plants. Flowering plants known as angiosperms are the most diverse group of land plants in the planet. The angiosperms spread across the world with at least 260,000 living species classified into 453 families. Traditionally, flowering plants have been divided into two major groups or classes on the basis of the number of cotyledons present in the seed. These two groups are the monocots and dicots. A cotyledon is a central portion of a seed embryo to which the epicotyl and radicle are attached. Plants that are monocots have one cotyledon and dicots have two cotyledons. To gain a better understanding of the various features of monocots and dicots, we will now study two plants, one a monocot and the other a dicot. To do the experiment, we will require an orchid plant that is a monocot and a hibiscus plant that is a dicot. Procedure. Ensure that both the plants you've taken have roots, leaves and flowers. Study the leaves of both the plants carefully by observing their venation. If the leaves have parallel venation, then the plant is a monocot, and if the leaves have reticulate venation, the plant is a dicot. In our case, the venation of the orchid leaf is parallel, so it is a monocot, and the venation of the hibiscus leaf is reticulate, so it is a dicot. There is another characteristic that helps differentiate a monocot and a dicot. If the leaves have a stalk, then the plant is a dicot, and if the leaves have no stalk, the plant is a monocot. When the leaf has no stalk, we call it sessile, meaning the leaf is attached directly by its base without a stalk. In an orchid plant, the leaf is sessile, so it is a monocot. The leaves of the hibiscus have a stalk, so it's a dicot. If you now take a look at the roots of both the plants and study the root system, you will see that roots differ in a monocot and a dicot. The monocot plant has just a bunch of roots. This type of root system is known as the adventitious root. The dicot plants has a taproot system. We can see that the orchid plants have an aerial root system. Aerial roots are almost always adventitious. So for the orchid plant, there's another vote for being a monocot. The hibiscus has a taproot system as seen in other dicot plants. Let us now move on to the stem. If you carefully observe the stem of both the plants, you will see that the orchid has a weak stem, whereas the hibiscus has a strong stem. Monocots normally have a weak stem and dicots have both weak and strong stems. Looking at our plants, the weak stem makes the orchid a monocot and the strong stem makes the hibiscus a dicot. Let's now carefully observe different parts of the orchid and hibiscus flowers. If you count the number of petals and sepals, you will find that the monocot flowers tend to have number of parts that are divisible by 3 and the dicot flowers have number of parts that are divisible by 4 or 5. In orchids, there are 3 petals and 3 sepals. One of the petals is modified to form a labellum or lip. Overall, an orchid satisfies the condition for a monocot plant. The hibiscus has 5 petals and 5 sepals like a typical dicot plant. From these observations, we can conclude that the orchid is a monocot and the hibiscus is a dicot plant.
Just like us, they're going to have tissues. And so in us, if we're talking about tissues, now you would think of muscular, nervous, connective, and then epithelial. But in plants, there are just going to be 3 types of tissues. They have dermal tissue, ground tissue, and then vascular tissue. And just like us, they break that into specific types of cells. We've got the epidermis, which is the dermal lining. And then we have periderm, which is going to be mostly when we get to the level of bark, so it's secondary growth. Function of that is to provide protection. So this is a cross-section of a leaf, so it's going to provide protection from the outside. Same thing right here, you can see this in a stem. We're going to have dermal tissues on the outside. And they also prevent water loss. So basically epidermis is the big type of dermal tissue. Ground tissue is going to be just run-of-the-mill cells. And so this is going to be broken into 3 types, and these words are really fun to say: parenchyma, collenchyma, and sclerenchyma. What do? Basically, they do the jobs of the plant. So they're going to be the site of photosynthesis, for example, in the leaf, but it's going to be metabolism, storage, growth, all of that's going to be in the ground tissue. And then finally, we have the vascular tissue. That's made up of 2 types, xylem and phloem, and they're going to move the water and the sugar. So we'll get more specific to each of these. So let's start with the dermal tissue. Dermal tissue, for the most part, is going to be epidermis. So right here, we're looking at a cross-section of a leaf. So this would be dermal tissue on the top and on the bottom. The guard cells also make up part of that. And the guard cells, you can see a zoomed in version of it right here. Basically what they do is they surround the stomata, or this opening. What does the stomata do? You can see it's the hole in the leaf. Basically, it allows water to evaporate out, and that water, as it evaporates out, is going to carry water all the way up in the plant. But they also bring in a really important gas. That's going to be CO2. And so plants kind of have guard cells that are doing really good feedback. Basically, if they have a lot of moisture and they can let a lot of it go and it's really sunny, they open the guard cells up, and the stomata are going to allow a lot of water to come out, a bunch of carbon dioxide in, and so they can make a bunch of sugars. Likewise, if it's really, really hot, really, really dry, they can close up the stomata so they don't lose all of their water. One thing that I should mention is going to be this real waxy covering on the epidermis. That's called the cuticle. And it's like wax. It's that wax that you feel on that slippery stuff you feel on the outside of a leaf, and that's going to prevent water from getting in and getting out. If we get to the ground tissue, basic run-of-the-mill cells are going to be parenchyma cells. The typical plant cells, parenchyma cells. What do? They're going to be the site of metabolism, site of photosynthesis. Outside that, as a plant starts to grow, we have the collenchyma. I always remember the C and the L, and collenchyma stands for celery. And so those are going to be these real durable cells on the outside of celery. They provide support as it starts to grow. And so you can see the dermis on the outside, collenchyma cells, and then these are going to be parenchyma cells right here. They provide support. And if you take a plant as it grows and just mess with it all the time, push it all the time, simulating like wind, the collenchyma gets stronger and stronger and stronger. But it never gets as strong as the sclerenchyma. Sclerenchyma are going to be the really durable, wooded kind of portions of the plant as it starts to grow. This is a sclerenchyma fiber that's cut in half. If we were to look at a fiber, we could find this. This is hemp. We pulled the sclerenchyma cells out to use these fibers to make rope. It's incredibly durable. And so sclerenchyma is going to be these big fibers that give it that really, really strong, like in a branch, that growth. But we'll also have sclerenchyma cells like the core of an apple, for example, is sclerenchyma. It's protecting the seeds on the inside. Or the grit on the inside of a pear is sclerenchyma. So that's the ground. Now we go to the vascular. Vascular is going to be made up of 2 types, the xylem and the phloem. So in this, we're cutting a stem apart. This would all be xylem in here, and then level 4 right here is going to be phloem. Basically, xylem is moving water. It's going to move water from the roots to the shoots. Phloem is going to move sugar up and down in a plant. And so on the outside we'd have dermis, and then we're going to have some sclerenchyma cells that are giving it durable support. So now we're going to talk about growth and then finally finish up with flowers. But this is an old story. If you go and take a spike and hammer it into a tree, let's say we put it at about 3 feet right here, and you come back in 100 years, let's say, make it more realistic, 40 years, and the tree now, instead of being whatever, 16 feet tall, is 160 feet tall. How high is that spike going to be? Well, the right answer is it'll still be 3 feet tall, because plants grow from the top and they grow from the bottom. They grow from the shoots and the roots, but the middle is going to stay the same. Now the bark is going to start to grow up, and so that tree the spike might not be as far in, but just like humans, we first grow up, get much, much longer, and then I could tell you this, as you get older, you start to get wider and wider and wider. And so we call this primary growth, this first growth. And how does that occur? Well, we use something called an apical meristem. Basically, that's going to be a site. Right here we're looking at a root where you have cells that keep copying themselves. We call those undifferentiated. Think of it like a stem cell that keeps making copies of itself. And so that's going to make new cells. And as those cells get longer, as they mature and get larger and larger and larger, that's going to push this stem or root in this direction. Now I can tell this right here is going to be a ram or a root apical meristem because it has this root cap on the top of it. And that root cap is going to allow it to push through the soil to find water. And so this meristem is actually going to produce new cells on this side, which will make the root cap, and then cells on this side that make this root itself. If you look up at the SAM or the shoot apical meristem, it's not going to have this root cap because it doesn't have to, it's just pushing its way through air, so it's not going to have this, but it's still going to have this meristem because it's producing new cells behind it, and as they mature, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So that's going to allow us to grow up and down, but we also have secondary growth. Secondary growth allows us to get wider. So secondary growth, think about wooded growth. And so we're looking at a tree now in this diagram that's been sliced in half, and we're zooming in kind of to the bark portion. And so basically what you have is xylem. So xylem is going to be here on the inside. So let's put an X for the xylem, and then you're going to have phloem here. And so what's creating the xylem and the phloem? This layer called vascular cambium. So what it's doing is it's producing new xylem here, and it's producing phloem on this side. The phloem, remember, moves the sugar, and the xylem is going to move the water. So we got xylem, vascular cambium, phloem. As we move up, you have a layer called the phyloderm, which isn't found in all plants, so let me cross that out. And then we have the cork cambium. So the cork cambium is another meristematic layer, and that, just like the vascular cambium made phloem and xylem, cork cambium is going to make this waterproof cork on the outside. And so this guy right here is peeling bark back from a tree, and so what is he exposing right here? He's really exposing the vascular cambium. He's got xylem on the inside, phloem on the outside. And so what he would really do, if this is a tree that's just standing, he would be girdling the tree, he'd be killing the tree. Because if you remove that phloem and everything out, then sugar can't move up and down in a plant. You'd still have the xylem here, but without sugar you can't have life. And so one thing you know around here when you cut down a tree is what you'll get are these rings. And so you see these rings. What are those rings? Well, the inside of a tree wood, for that matter, is going to be xylem. And so basically what happens is it's going to be wider when the cells are laid down during summer because it's growing really, really quickly. But in the fall, it's going to be more dense, and in the spring, because we can't grow as quickly, not at all in the winter, and so you get these seasonal rings. And so we can count them when it's growing fast, slow, and we can count the years if we take a core sample. What would this look like in an area where there is no seasons? It's basically going to be uniform all the way